It's one of the biggest fails in business history, Toys R Us. You may think you know the story. Amazon swoops in and destroys an old school business model that couldn't keep up with the times. But contrary to popular belief, Toys R Us's problems weren't really about e-commerce or online shopping at all. And actually, the company was still selling 1 out of every 5 toys in America when it went bankrupt in 2017. I'm Jen Clinehens, and this is Choice Hacking. Today, I'm going to break down the sneaky business and psychology traps that Toys R Us fell into, ultimately killed the brand, and that you might fall for too. To understand why Toys R Us failed, you really need to understand why it succeeded, at least at first. Founded in 1948 by Charles Lazarus, Toys R Us started as a baby furniture store called Children's Supermart in Washington, D.C. at the height of the post-war baby boom in the U.S. Charles Lazarus was himself a returning GI, and he had sat talking with his fellow servicemen for many hours about their plans when they got home. And pretty much every young man he talked to at the time talked about starting a family. Lazarus, a savvy businessman, even then, had an uncle who was already in the furniture business. So the natural next step was for Charles to go back to the US and to start a baby furniture store. So Lazarus was smart and he was set up for success. But then when he opened the store, he started noticing something interesting. Parents who were buying cribs and high chairs kept asking if he sold toys too. And the more he thought about it, the more toys seemed like a much better product to focus on than baby furniture. After all, parents only buy 1 crib and 1 high chair, and then they pass those down to their younger kids. But with toys, there wasn't really a limit on how many toys one family could own. And the more kids played with toys, the more that they broke and wore out. Every birthday and Christmas, there were grandparents and parents desperately searching for that perfect new and trendy toy to gift their kids, and that changed every single year. Basically, Lazarus figured out he could make much more money per customer over their entire time of being a customer. This is what businesses call customer lifetime value. And the higher it is, the more money a business can make for longer. So in short, toys were just a much more attractive market. So he pivoted, and Children's Supermart became Toys R Us, named after Charles Laz R. Us in 1957. They grew really fast after they got acquired by a retail conglomerate called Interstate Stores. And by the 1970s, Toys R Us was in nearly every US state. But here's something you probably don't know. Toys R Us almost went bankrupt in the 1970s, but how they escaped to become even more powerful was a bit of a double-edged sword. And in fact, the same thing that saved them in the 1970s was the thing that ultimately killed them in 2017. In 1974, Toys R Us's parent company, Interstate Stores, was in big trouble. They declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and Toys R Us nearly went down with the ship. But by the 1970s, Toys R Us was so big and so critical to the toy industry as a whole that the Toy Manufacturers Association stepped in on their behalf to convince banks to bail them out. If it wasn't for their quick adoption of a brand new toy category, Toys R Us might have met its end way back in the 1970s. You see, Charles Lazarus saw the potential of electronic toys like Speak and Spell and Pong much more quickly than other people in the industry. Electronic toys were much more profitable than a doll or a bike, and people wanted them. They'd camp out and stand in line for hours to get their hands on a Teddy Ruxpin. So rather than be left behind, Toys R Us leaned heavily into the shift to electronic toys. And by the 1980s, they were the mecca of toy shopping, not only in the US, but in many other countries like Australia, Canada, and the UK. And after 30 years in business, Toys R Us was the most powerful name in toys. There were 3 things that made them so unstoppable. First, they had unmatched selection and scale. No other store at the time came close to their massive toy inventory. So when you wanted that hot toy for Christmas, Toys R Us was the place that actually had it in stock. Second, they dominated toy manufacturers. Toys R Us was so big that toy companies had to play by their rules. They got the best prices, the first shipments, and exclusive products. And third, they created kind of a magical experience that you couldn't really get anywhere else. Shopping at Toys R Us wasn't just about buying toys off of a shelf. It was an adventure. Kids would just drag their parents through these massive stores for hours. That's why for decades, Toys R Us was the destination to shop for toys more than any brand before or since. In the 1980s, it seemed like no toy store would ever be able to seriously compete with Toys R Us. But there was a villain on the horizon, watching and waiting for their opportunity to take Toys R Us down. Toys R Us was what was called a category killer in retail, meaning that it was a specialized retailer that dominated a specific product category by offering an unusually deep assortment of that particular type of product. In this case, toys. So other category killers include bookstores like Barnes & Noble, electronics retailers like Best Buy, or office supply store Office Depot. And here's the really interesting thing. Toys R Us wasn't just a category killer. It was the original category killer that inspired all those other stores in different industries. But in the late 90s, a challenger emerged from the shadows to try to take down the king of toys. Surprisingly, it wasn't another specialty toy retailer. It was the big box discount retail monster known as Walmart, whose size and sheer number of stores were a serious threat. And that size and physical availability gave Walmart two key business advantages in the battle for toy supremacy. First, Walmart could negotiate better prices from suppliers than even Toys R Us could because of its massive size. Bigger sales and more stores meant they could sell in volumes that Toys R Us just couldn't match. Second, Walmart had the advantage of being an everything store, whereas Toys R Us was more of a destination. If you went to Walmart for groceries or new tires, your kids could wander over to the toy section and pick up a Hot Wheels toy or a Barbie on impulse. But to go to Toys R Us, parents had to plan a trip specifically to Toys R Us. And once your kids got there, they'd probably throw a fit if you left empty-handed. So lots of parents just avoided Toys R Us completely, unless it was close to a birthday or Christmas. By 1998, Toys R Us fell from its spot of being the #1 toy store in America, and Walmart took its place. Just 5 years later, the impact of Walmart was undeniable. Toys R Us was truly in trouble, struggling with flat sales and shrinking profits. But just like in the 1970s, they weren't done fighting. They had a sneaky strategy up their sleeve that, while clever, ultimately destroyed them. By 2004, Toys R Us was struggling, but the company was still profitable. It just wasn't growing fast enough for Wall Street. So the board of directors made a fateful decision. They sold the company to 3 notorious financial firms, Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust for $6.6 billion. But this wasn't just any ordinary sale. It was what's called a leveraged buyout, which sounds great on paper, but in reality set them up for a sticky psychological trap that's killed so many of the businesses that I talk about on this channel. A leveraged buyout means someone buys a business, but they don't have the cash or they just don't want to spend the cash to pay for it. So they borrow, and usually they borrow a lot. In this case, the firms that bought Toys R Us only put up about 20% in cash, which was nothing to sneeze at. It was $1.3 billion, but then they borrowed the other 80%, which was over $5 billion. But here's the kicker on a leveraged buyout. To pay that debt that the new owners have taken on to buy the company, they use the company's own sales and assets to pay the debt. So think of it this way. If you bought a house, but you couldn't afford to pay for it in cash, you take out a mortgage. But what if you don't have a job or any savings? Well, you might rent out the house and use the rent money to pay the mortgage. But what happens when no one wants to rent your house or the roof needs to get replaced? Well, then there's no money to pay for it, so you just kind of hope the tenants don't notice. But then with a leaky roof, you can't find new tenants and you can't pay the mortgage, so you have to get rid of the house. On a bigger scale, that's the thinking with a leveraged buyout. As long as the profits keep rolling in, you can pay the debt. But if sales slow down or stop, or your profit margins get smaller because you need to lower your prices, or the rent goes up on your store, well, then you're in big trouble. And that's exactly what happened to Toys R Us. So now you have two big forces chipping away at Toys R Us. The external force of Walmart and Amazon, who were taking big bites out of Toys R Us's sales, market share, and profits. And then the internal force of having to pay down the debt they created in the leveraged buyout. There was a third, sneakier force at play: the psychology of a firm under pressure. You see, Toys R Us wasn't just paying down the debt. They also had to pay down the interest on that debt, which was about $400 million a year. Not to mention that the private equity firms that now own the brand charged fees for their so-called management and advisory services, reportedly around $250 million in total, which meant that Toys R Us's cash reserves were shrinking fast. They started at over $2 billion in cash and went down to just $301 million by 2017. And the problem was they needed that money to refurbish their aging stores, to build out an e-commerce infrastructure, and to compete with Amazon and Walmart. So stores became shabby and outdated, which was a problem because the magical experience of a Toys R Us store was the reason that people still shop there. The Toys R Us website stayed clunky and hard to navigate, while Amazon got better every single year and perfected their free overnight shipping with Prime, a lifesaver during the holiday season. Employee training got cut, customer service suffered, but while Toys R Us was dying, the private equity firms were getting rich. They charged advisory fees of millions a year, supposedly for business advice, but they didn't have to provide any actual services for those fees. Meanwhile, Toys R Us was already paying expensive consulting firms like McKinsey for real advice, who charged transaction fees every time they restructured Toys R Us's debt. So every financial move to try to get them out of the hole that the brand was in became another payday for the consulting companies and private equity firms that were supposed to be helping them. This created what's called a perverse incentive, or a Cobra effect, which basically meant every time Toys R Us tried to solve their problems, they got worse, because the people who were supposed to be helping them were actually getting paid money to dig them deeper into a giant financial hole. These consulting and private equity firms weren't getting rewarded to fix the business, and there were no financial incentives for them to make things better. In fact, a healthy, debt-free Toys R Us would have made them a whole lot less money. So eventually, and unsurprisingly, that death spiral killed them. In 2017, despite still being a leading toy retailer and selling about 20% of all toys sold in the US, Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy. 33,000 people lost their jobs, their suppliers lost $800 million in unpaid bills, but the private equity firms walked away with millions in profits. Just like so many of the other business failure stories I've shared on this channel about brands like Blockbuster, Sears, and many, many more, Toys R Us's debt, their leveraged buyout debt in this case, ruined their chances to become competitive with retailers like Walmart and Amazon. And look, I think if there's one thing you can take away from all of these stories, it's this. Debt is a tool for business. It's not all good and it's not all bad, but debt becomes a huge problem when a business or industry is under threat because it changes the way a company makes decisions. All of a sudden, they're playing it safe when they should be taking risks. They're staying the course when they should be innovating, and they're servicing their debts and not their customers.